The Hendrix farm still exists on county maps, outlined in thin black ink like any other piece of land, but in reality it no longer feels like a place meant for the living. The gravel road that once led to its gates has been swallowed by weeds, and the wooden sign with the family name, Hendrix, hangs crooked, one rusted chain clinging to a post that leans as if exhausted by time itself. What used to be neat rows of corn now resemble a tangled sea of dead stalks, rattling softly whenever the wind passes through, producing a sound uncannily close to whispering. No animals graze the fields anymore. The barns stand with their doors half open, frozen in the last moment they were ever used, and inside them, dust floats in the air where hay once smelled warm and sweet. At night, there are no lights. Not in the farmhouse windows. Not in the yard. Just darkness settling heavy over the land, as if the farm itself has learned to hold its breath. But the silence did not arrive naturally. It was noticed. It was broken first by absence. On a cold Tuesday morning in early October, a neighboring farmer named Harold Boone stood at the fence line separating his land from the Hendrix property and realized something that made him pause longer than usual. The cows hadn't been milked. Elias Hendrix's herd followed a routine as strict as a clock, and for more than 20 years, Harold had been able to tell the time of day by the distant, familiar sounds of Elias moving through his barn. The low groans, the metal clink of buckets, the steady rhythm of a man who never rushed and never missed a step. That morning, there was nothing. By noon, Harold still hadn't seen Elias's truck. By late afternoon, the unease had grown into something heavier, something that pressed at the back of his thoughts no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it. Elias didn't leave town without saying something. He didn't sleep in. He didn't forget. When Harold finally crossed the fence and walked up toward the farmhouse, he expected annoyance. Maybe Elias had fallen ill and would wave him away from the porch with an embarrassed smile. Instead, he found the front door unlocked. Inside the house, everything looked paused. A plate of food sat on the kitchen table, untouched, steam long gone, but the meal still strangely fresh, as if it had been prepared not hours ago, but minutes. A mug of coffee stood beside it, a thin brown ring marking where it had once been lifted and set back down. The radio by the window was on, tuned to a local station, murmuring softly to no one at all. Elias Hendrix's work boots were not by the door. They were never anywhere else. The first official report came later that evening, after a deputy arrived and confirmed what Harold already knew in his gut. Something was deeply wrong. By the time the sun dipped behind the tree-line and shadows stretched across the fields, red and blue lights cut through the darkness for the first time in years, reflecting off the farmhouse windows like a warning the land itself had chosen to ignore. Then there was the sound. At 8:30 p.m., several miles away, another neighbor, this one closer to the ravine that marked the far edge of the Hendrix property, reported hearing what he described as metal screaming against stone. It was followed by a low, thunderous crash, the kind that vibrated through the ground rather than the air. At the time, he assumed it was a fallen tree or distant construction. It wasn't until the next day, when word spread that Elias Hendrix was missing, that the sound began replaying in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. When investigators finally reached the far field, they found the tractor. It was overturned near the ravine, one wheel still slowly spinning, engine long dead but warm to the touch. The fence beside it was broken outward, not inward, as though something heavy had been forced through it. Deep gouges scarred the earth, dragging marks that ended abruptly at the edge of the ravine itself. There were footprints in the dirt, Elias's size, Elias's stride. They stopped. No trail leading down. No signs of a body being carried away. Just an ending, sharp and sudden, like a sentence cut off mid-word. Back at the farmhouse, deputies made another discovery that none of them could quite explain. Elias's wallet lay neatly on the bedroom dresser, beside his watch and house keys. His phone was charging on the nightstand. Everything a man would need to leave was there, untouched. Everything except the man. By the third day, volunteers had flooded the area, combing through fields and woods, calling his name until their voices grew hoarse. Dogs were brought in, trained noses pressed to the ground, following a scent that made sense, until it didn't. Each dog led their handler to the same place, the edge of the ravine. And every single time, the trail vanished, as if Elias Hendrix had simply dissolved into the air. The official explanation, at least at first, was simple. A tragic farming accident. A fall. A body lost in difficult terrain. But nothing about the scene felt simple. Elias Hendrix was a man who knew every inch of his land, every soft patch of soil, every dangerous slope. He had worked these fields since he was young enough to barely reach the tractor pedals, and he had survived storms, machinery failures, and decades of labor without a single serious injury. So how did a man like that vanish on his own property, leaving behind warm food, running equipment, and a trail that ended in nothing? The Hendrix farm does not answer that question. It only stands there now, quiet, abandoned, watching, holding on to whatever happened that night, and refusing to let it go. And the longer you look at it, the harder it becomes to believe that Elias Hendrix ever truly left at all. To understand why the disappearance of Elias Hendrix unsettled the entire county, it is necessary to understand the man himself, not as a headline or a missing person poster, but as a presence that had shaped the rhythm of the land for decades. Elias Hendrix was not the kind of man people described in a single sentence. Those who tried usually failed, resorting to vague phrases like quiet but solid, or one of the good ones, yet neither quite captured him. He was a man of habits, yes, but also a man of quiet contradictions. He woke before sunrise every morning, even on days when there was no immediate reason to, and yet he often stayed up late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out before him, pencil tapping softly, as if he were arguing with himself. He drank his coffee black, refused to own a smartphone until the old flip phone finally stopped holding a charge, and never locked his doors during the day. At the same time, he was meticulous to the point of obsession when it came to his work. Every tool in the barn had its place. Every gate was checked twice. Every machine was shut down properly, allowed to cool, and inspected before being left alone. He was the kind of man who believed that accidents didn't just happen, they were invited by carelessness. That belief had come from somewhere deeper than farming. Years earlier, Elias had lost his wife, Margaret, to a highway collision caused by a driver who looked away for just a second. From that moment on, Elias developed an almost ritualistic relationship with safety and preparation, as if attention and routine could form a shield against chaos itself. Neighbors noticed it in small ways. The way he refused to drive after dark unless absolutely necessary, the way he wore reflective gear even on private roads, the way he double-checked weather forecasts before doing anything remotely risky. So when authorities later suggested that Elias had suffered a simple accident, those who knew him felt a quiet resistance rise in their chests. Elias Hendrix did not take chances. He did not cut corners. And he certainly did not wander into danger without a reason. In the months before he disappeared, that reason may have finally arrived. For the first time in decades, Elias had been making plans that extended beyond the next harvest. Inside the farmhouse, investigators later found folders filled with neatly organized documents, land assessments, legal correspondence, handwritten notes detailing expenses and projections. He had been in talks with a regional developer, someone interested in buying part of the property that bordered the ravine. It was land Elias rarely used, rocky and difficult to work, but valuable to outsiders looking to expand. Selling that section would have changed everything. Those close to him noticed the shift. Elias had started talking, cautiously at first, about downsizing, about letting go of pieces of the land that had once defined him. More surprisingly, he had begun speaking about his daughter, Claire, a subject he had avoided for nearly 10 years. Their relationship had fractured after Margaret's death, splintered by grief and words spoken too sharply, too soon. Claire had left for the city, and Elias had stayed, each believing the other had chosen distance. But recently, letters had been exchanged. Real letters. Handwritten. Careful. Elias had mentioned to a neighbor, almost casually, that Claire might come to visit before winter. He said it like it was nothing, like it didn't matter, but the way he straightened his jacket afterward gave him away. There was talk of reconciliation, of apologies long overdue, of a future that did not end with an empty farmhouse and silent fields. He had even cleaned out the spare bedroom. The night Elias disappeared was not supposed to be dramatic or dangerous. By all accounts, it was ordinary. He had followed his routine with almost obsessive precision. He stopped by the local feed store just before closing, chatting briefly with the owner about rising costs and early frost predictions. He actually joked, about finally taking a break next year, about letting someone else worry over soil quality and machinery repairs. At 6 p.m., he left the store with a receipt neatly folded into his pocket. At 7:15 p.m., a neighbor saw his truck lights sweep across the driveway, just as they had thousands of times before. Elias waved, the familiar gesture barely visible through the windshield, and parked exactly where he always did. The porch light flicked on. The house came alive. Nothing about that evening suggested it would be the last time anyone saw him, which is precisely what makes the question impossible to ignore. Why did a man who avoided night work step back outside after dinner? Why did someone so devoted to routine leave his boots by the door and walk into the dark fields without his phone, his wallet, or his keys? Why did a man planning a future, one that included reconciliation, change, and perhaps freedom from the land that had held him for so long, suddenly place himself in harm's way? Elias Hendrix was not running from his life. If anything, he was finally running toward it. And yet, somewhere between the kitchen table and the edge of the ravine, something happened that even his careful nature could not account for, something that pulled him out of his routine, out of safety, and into a silence that still hasn't released him. The night Elias Hendrix disappeared did not announce itself as dangerous. There were no emergency alerts, no violent winds bending the trees, no lightning tearing open the sky. If anything, the weather felt deceptively calm, the kind of autumn evening farmers welcomed after a long day, cool, still, and quiet enough to hear insects moving through the grass. But calm, as it would later become clear, was not the same as safe. At 6 p.m., Elias was seen at the local feed store on the edge of town, a place that doubled as an informal gathering spot for farmers who wanted to exchange news without admitting they were lonely. The clerk remembered him clearly, partly because Elias lingered longer than usual, carefully checking the labels on feed bags he had purchased 100 times before. He asked about supply delays, nodded thoughtfully, and made a small comment about making sure everything's squared away before winter. When he paid, he used cash, waited for his change, and folded the receipt with deliberate care, sliding it into his jacket pocket like it mattered. Nothing about him seemed rushed. Nothing about him seemed distracted. At 6:42 p.m., Elias's truck was captured briefly on a traffic camera at the edge of the county road, its headlights cutting through the early darkness. The footage shows him driving well below the speed limit, hands steady on the wheel. Investigators later noted that the truck never swerved, never braked suddenly, never did anything to suggest distress. It was, in every measurable way, the drive of a man heading home. By 7:15 p.m., Elias had pulled into his driveway. A neighbor working late in his own barn noticed the familiar pattern of light sweeping across the gravel and looked up just in time to see Elias lift one hand from the steering wheel in a habitual wave. The truck door closed. The porch light flicked on. From the outside, the farmhouse looked exactly as it had for decades, occupied, grounded, alive. Inside, Elias prepared a simple dinner. The plate later found on the table held nothing extravagant: meat, vegetables, bread. The kind of meal that suggested routine rather than indulgence. The radio played quietly in the background, tuned to a local station that Elias favored because it never surprised him. There were no outgoing calls from his phone during this time, no messages sent, no signs that anyone else was there. And yet, sometime after 8 p.m., Elias put on his jacket. This detail would puzzle investigators more than most. The jacket was practical but unnecessary. The temperature had not dropped significantly, and Elias rarely layered unless he expected to be outside for an extended period. Still, the jacket was gone from its hook by the door. His boots, however, remained where they always were. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the night fractured. A neighbor living near the far end of the Hendrix property reported hearing a sound that did not belong in the natural landscape. It was described as metal failing under stress, followed by a violent impact that echoed once and then stopped abruptly. There were no cries for help, no secondary noises, just a sudden, brutal interruption, and then silence rushing back in as if nothing had happened at all. When investigators later reconstructed the scene, they focused on the tractor. It had been parked near the fence line earlier that day, positioned close to the ravine Elias rarely approached after dark. The machine was old but well-maintained, serviced regularly, and familiar to him in a way few things were. Yet when it was found the next morning, it lay on its side at an unnatural angle, one rear wheel bent, the front axle twisted as though the tractor had met resistance it was never meant to encounter. The engine was no longer running, but it was warm. The fence beside it had been torn apart, not snapped cleanly but dragged outward, boards splintered, and bent away from the field. The ground bore deep marks, tire tracks that veered suddenly, grooves carved by metal scraping against rock, and signs of movement that suggested chaos rather than control. What it did not show was just as troubling. There was no blood, no scattered tools, no evidence that Elias had been working on the tractor in any routine sense. It was as if he had arrived there suddenly, in the dark, without preparation. Footprints led away from the tractor toward the ravine, measured and familiar at first, then uneven, as though the ground had shifted beneath him or his balance had been compromised. And then they ended, not at the bottom of the ravine, not hidden among rocks or brush. They simply stopped at the edge, leaving nothing behind but disturbed soil and unanswered questions. Search teams scoured the slope below, expecting to find a body lodged somewhere out of sight, but the terrain offered no such conclusion. No clothing, no signs of impact, no indication that a fall had occurred at all. Back at the farmhouse, the scene remained frozen in time. Dinner still sat on the table. The radio still murmured. Elias's phone remained plugged in, untouched, and his wallet lay on the dresser exactly where he had left it. To investigators, it looked less like a man who had planned to work late and more like someone who had stepped outside intending to return within minutes. That intent, the assumption of safety, of familiarity, is what haunts the timeline. Because somewhere between 8 o'clock and 8:30 p.m., Elias Hendrix made a decision that broke his own rules. He went into the night without his boots, without his phone, without the things he never forgot. He walked toward a part of his land he avoided after dark, and whatever met him, there ended his routine forever. Whether it was machinery failure, a misstep, or something no one had accounted for yet, the result was the same. By the time the sound echoed across the fields and faded into silence, Elias Hendrix had vanished, and the land he knew better than anyone else offered no explanation in return. By sunrise the following morning, the Hendrix farm no longer belonged to itself. It became a grid on a map, a problem to be solved, a place measured in coordinates and search patterns. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed by state investigators, then volunteers, men and women who had known Elias for years, and those who had only known his name, but felt compelled to help all the same. Orange tape marked boundaries where there had never been boundaries before, and the quiet fields filled with voices calling a name that did not answer back. The official assumption was still an accident. A tractor rollover near a ravine was not unheard of, and the absence of a body was explained away as a matter of terrain and time. The slope was steep in places, deceptive in others, and the undergrowth below could easily conceal someone. Yet even as the search began, there was an undercurrent of unease among those closest to the case. Too many things refused to align. Too many small details felt misplaced, like furniture shifted in a dark room. Search dogs were brought in before noon. They were trained animals, experienced, and their handlers expected a straightforward result. The dogs were given Elias's jacket to establish a scent, and almost immediately, they moved with confidence, pulling their handlers across the fields in a path that mirrored the known timeline. Past the tractor, toward the ravine, toward the place everyone already suspected. And then, all at once, every single dog reacted the same way. At the edge of the ravine, the scent ended. Not weakened, not scattered, but stopped. The dogs circled, confused, noses pressed hard into the soil, then sat back on their haunches, looking up as if waiting for an instruction that never came. One handler later described it as watching a sentence end with a period where there should have been a comma. No one could explain it. Teams descended into the ravine anyway, cutting through brush, probing shadows, turning over stones. Hours passed, then days. Nothing emerged. Not even a trace that Elias had ever gone down there. It was as if he had approached the edge, stood there, and vanished before gravity had a chance to do its work. As the initial searches expanded outward, investigators turned back to the farmhouse, combing through it with fresh eyes. That was when the first real crack appeared in the accident theory. Elias's wallet had been found inside the house, resting on the bedroom dresser. At first, this seemed unremarkable. Many farmers worked their land without carrying personal items. But the more the timeline was examined, the less sense it made. Elias had driven into town that evening. He had paid at the feed store. He had spoken to people. The receipt was in his pocket when he left. So where was that pocket now? More troubling was what the wallet contained. Cash was still inside. His identification was there. Nothing was missing. If Elias had stepped outside to check on something, why leave behind the one item he never forgot when leaving the house? And if he had returned inside after the tractor incident, why was there no sign of panic, no disturbed furniture, no attempt to call for help? Then came the phone records. Elias's phone had not left the nightstand, according to its last known location data. It had not moved, had not powered down, had not been damaged. But at 9:12 p.m., nearly 40 minutes after the sound reported by the neighbor, a text message had been sent from Elias's number. The message was brief. 4 words, "I'll handle it tomorrow." It was sent to a contact saved simply as R. Investigators could not determine who R was with certainty. There were no outgoing calls before or after the message. No reply ever came back. The phone showed no signs of being handled at that time. No fingerprints, no movement recorded by internal sensors. Technically, the message should not have been possible. Yet there it was. As news of the text spread, the tone of the investigation shifted. Deputies began asking different questions, revisiting conversations, examining Elias's recent dealings more closely. Attention turned to the potential land sale, to the disputed section near the ravine, to the fact that not everyone had been pleased by Elias's refusal to rush the decision. A quiet disagreement, once considered irrelevant, now felt heavier, edged with possibility. Still, there was no evidence of a struggle involving another person. No unknown footprints. No signs of forced entry. The farm had given up everything it seemed willing to give, and nothing more. After a week, the official search was scaled back. Volunteers continued to return on their own time, walking the fields, checking the woods, staring into the ravine as if expecting the land to blink first. But Elias Hendrix did not reappear. The case shifted categories from active search to open investigation, a phrase that sounded reassuring but meant very little in practice. The truth was simple and deeply unsettling. Elias Hendrix had disappeared in a place he knew better than anyone, leaving behind evidence that suggested both accident and intention, both routine and disruption. Every explanation raised new questions. Every answer felt incomplete. And somewhere between the locked farmhouse and the silent ravine, something, or someone, was still unaccounted for. In the months that followed Elias Hendrix's disappearance, the Hendrix farm slowly slipped back into stillness, but it was no longer the innocent quiet it once carried. It became a place people talked about in lowered voices, a landmark given directions with hesitation. "You know, near the Hendrix place," they would say, as if the land itself had gained a reputation. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it fractured into theories. The first was the simplest, and the one authorities returned to whenever questions grew uncomfortable: a tragic accident. The tractor malfunctioned. Elias slipped in the dark. The ravine, unpredictable and unforgiving, claimed him without leaving behind what people expected to find. Nature, after all, does not always provide closure. Sometimes it only erases. But for those who knew Elias, this explanation never fully settled. Accidents happen, but they rarely happen to men who spend their lives preparing for them. Elias was careful to the point of ritual, a man who believed survival was something you earned through attention and discipline. If this was an accident, it was one that required him to break every rule he lived by, all in the span of a single, inexplicable decision. Then there was the second theory, whispered more than spoken. What if Elias had staged it? The idea felt almost insulting at first, yet it persisted. The missing boots, the wallet left behind, the phone that never moved, yet somehow sent a message after the crash, the land sale negotiations, the long-delayed reconciliation with his daughter. To some, it painted the picture of a man standing at the edge of a life he was ready to leave behind, not out of despair, but out of necessity. If Elias wanted to disappear, the farm would have been the perfect accomplice. It knew his habits. It knew how accidents were supposed to look, and if he had help, someone who knew the terrain, someone connected to that mysterious R, then the impossible details began to feel less impossible. Still, there was no proof, no financial trail, no confirmed sightings, no moment where Elias stepped cleanly into a new life, which led to the third and most unsettling possibility, that Elias did not leave on his own terms. The disputed land near the ravine was valuable, and not everyone was willing to wait for a careful man to make up his mind. A confrontation, even a small one, could have escalated quickly in the dark, near heavy machinery and unstable ground. The broken fence, the twisted tractor, the abrupt end of the footprints. Each detail could be read not as coincidence, but as interruption. Yet again, there were no witnesses, no signs of another presence, no evidence strong enough to anchor the suspicion to reality. And so the case remained suspended between explanations, never fully settling into any of them. The farmhouse still stands, locked and empty, its windows reflecting the fields Elias once walked every day. The tractor has been removed, the broken fence repaired, but the ravine remains unchanged, cutting through the land like a scar that never healed. People say the farm feels different now, heavier somehow, as if it remembers something it refuses to share. Sometimes, at dusk, headlights slow as they pass the property. Drivers glance toward the fields, half expecting to see a figure standing near the fence line, checking the land one last time before night falls. No one ever does. Elias Hendrix vanished into a place he understood better than anyone, leaving behind a story that resists a single ending. Whether it was a tragic accident, a carefully staged disappearance, or something darker that has yet to surface, the truth remains out there, held somewhere between routine and disruption, between what makes sense and what never will. So the question lingers, unanswered and uncomfortable. Did Elias Hendrix lose his life on that land? Or did the farm simply learn how to keep his secret? What do you think happened? Was this the result of a devastating accident, a calculated escape, or something far more deliberate? Share your theory in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, make sure to pass it on, because some disappearances don't end when the search does. After the search teams left and the last official notice was posted on the courthouse bulletin board, life in the county resumed in a way that felt almost offensive to those who had known Elias Hendrix. Crops were harvested, roads were salted, new problems replaced old conversations. Yet the absence he left behind did not fade. It settled in, embedding itself into the routines of others the way grief often does. For weeks, the farmhouse remained exactly as it had been on the night Elias disappeared. Law enforcement had sealed it at first, then released it when no further evidence emerged. No one rushed to enter. Neighbors passed by slowly, glancing at the porch light that never came on again, the mailbox that slowly filled and overflowed. Eventually, the mail stopped coming. Silence, once noticed, became permanent. Claire Hendrix arrived 3 weeks later. She drove in from the city alone, her car unfamiliar against the rural backdrop, its tires crunching on the same gravel road her father had driven all his life. Those who saw her later said she looked unprepared, not for the landscape, but for the finality of it. She stood in the yard for a long time before going inside, as if waiting for permission from a place that no longer belonged to anyone. Inside the house, she found the evidence of a life paused mid-thought. Her father's handwriting on notepads. The spare bedroom cleared out for a visit that would never happen. The jacket missing from its hook. She reportedly sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at the place where his dinner had gone cold, trying to reconcile the man she had known with the man the investigation described. Claire spoke to investigators only once. She confirmed that they had been talking again, slowly, cautiously, rebuilding something fragile. Elias had mentioned stress, but never fear. He had talked about the land sale as a burden, not a threat. When asked about the mysterious contact labeled R, she shook her head. It meant nothing to her. If her father was hiding something, she said, he had always been careful enough to keep it quiet. After Claire left, the farm entered a new phase of its existence. People stopped calling it the Hendrix farm and began calling it that place. Teenagers dared each other to drive past it at night. Hunters avoided the woods near the ravine, claiming the area felt wrong, though none could explain why. One volunteer searcher admitted years later that he still dreamed about the footprints that ended without explanation, as if his mind refused to accept an ending without a body. The investigation, meanwhile, stalled. The text message remained the most troubling anomaly, examined and re-examined by digital specialists who could never conclusively prove how it had been sent. Some suggested delayed transmission. Others proposed a system error. None could explain why it had gone to that specific contact, or why Elias, so careful, so deliberate, would phrase it the way he did. "I'll handle it tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Over time, the theories hardened into beliefs. Some residents became convinced Elias had outsmarted everyone, slipping away from a life he was finally ready to release. Others believed the ravine held answers no one had been brave enough, or lucky enough, to uncover. A smaller, quieter group believed something worse had happened, something that required silence to survive. What united them all was the same uncomfortable truth. No one ever truly moved on. The land where Elias Hendrix vanished continued to exist, unchanged, unbothered by human confusion. Seasons passed over it like pages turning in a book that refused to explain itself. And with every year that went by, the absence of answers grew heavier, not lighter. Because when a man disappears without a trace, he does not simply leave behind questions. He leaves behind a space where certainty used to be. When a disappearance refuses to resolve itself, investigators eventually do the only thing left to them. They go backward, not in a straight line, but in careful circles, replaying moments that once seemed ordinary, searching for fractures in the familiar. In the case of Elias Hendrix, that rewind began not at the ravine, but hours earlier, in places no one had thought to question. The feed store was revisited first. The clerk, when interviewed again weeks later, mentioned something that had not felt important at the time. Elias hadn't just been checking labels. He had been checking expiration dates. He'd held one bag longer than necessary, turning it over twice, before setting it back and choosing another. When asked why that stood out, the clerk hesitated before answering. He acted like someone who wouldn't be around to use it. He finally said, then quickly added that he didn't mean anything by it. Still, the comment lingered in the report, underlined once in blue ink. Security footage from the store showed Elias pausing at the door before leaving, hand resting briefly on the frame, as if grounding himself. It lasted less than a second, too short to mean anything definitive, but long enough to be noticed once people were looking for meaning. Then there was the drive home. Traffic cameras showed no irregularities, but one detail stood out on closer inspection. Elias did not take the fastest route. He took the old road, the one that curved past the disputed parcel near the ravine. It added nearly 10 minutes to the trip, and according to neighbors, he rarely used it anymore, especially at night. When asked about it later, no one could recall a reason why he would have chosen that road, unless he wanted to pass that section of land intentionally. At the farmhouse, the timeline narrowed. Forensic analysis suggested Elias ate only a few bites of his meal before standing up. The chair was pushed back neatly, not hurriedly. There were no signs of distress, no spilled drink, no knocked-over objects. Whatever pulled him away from the table did so quietly, without urgency, or at least without panic. The jacket, investigators realized, was not chosen at random. It was the one with the inside pocket. That pocket, when examined later, contained nothing, but it had once held something. The lining was slightly stretched, worn in a way that suggested repeated use. Elias did not typically carry items in his jacket pockets while working. He preferred his pants. The jacket was for short trips, conversations, inspections, for meetings. Then there was the tractor. Experts brought in months later confirmed that the mechanical damage did not match a simple rollover. The angle of the bent axle suggested lateral force, not just gravity. Something had caused the tractor to turn sharply, abruptly, as if reacting to an obstacle or a sudden presence. There were no animal remains, no fallen trees, nothing natural large enough to explain the movement. More curious still was the engine. It had not failed. It had been shut off. The ignition switch was found in the off position, a detail that contradicted early assumptions. Elias had either turned it off himself, or someone else had. That meant the sound heard at 8:30 p.m. was not the engine dying, but the machine impacting the fence and ground while already powerless, momentum carrying it forward without control. which raised a question no one had asked aloud yet. Why would Elias turn off the tractor near the ravine at night, unless he intended to get off? The footprints added another layer. They were not rushed. They did not suggest flight or confusion at first. The stride length was consistent with someone walking deliberately, perhaps toward another person. Only near the end did they become uneven, as if the ground shifted or the situation changed suddenly. That final disturbance, the last scuff before nothing, remained impossible to interpret. And then there was the text message. Digital analysts eventually noticed something subtle but significant. The message was typed, not dictated. Elias almost never typed messages. Arthritis in his hands made it uncomfortable. He preferred calls or voice notes. Yet this message was clean, precise, and spelled perfectly. It read like a promise. Or a delay. I'll handle it tomorrow. Tomorrow implied continuation. Responsibility. Not fear. Not farewell. As these details accumulated, the story of a simple accident began to collapse under its own weight. The night no longer looked like a man making a mistake. It looked like a man responding to something. Or someone. Still, nothing concrete emerged. No suspect stepped forward. No definitive motive surfaced. The investigation hovered in that uncomfortable space between suspicion and proof, where questions multiply faster than answers. And the most unsettling realization came quietly, without ceremony. If Elias Hendrix had met someone on his land that night, it was likely someone he expected to see. Land disputes rarely begin loudly. They start in paperwork, in polite conversations weighed down by unspoken pressure, in numbers written neatly at the bottom of a page. In Elias Hendrix's case, the disputed parcel near the ravine was officially described as marginal, yet everyone involved understood its real value. It bordered a future access road, sat atop mineral-rich soil, and offered something increasingly rare, space. Elias had owned it outright. That fact alone had made him an obstacle. County records showed that over the previous year, 3 separate inquiries had been made about purchasing or leasing that section of land. 2 had come from developers. 1 had come from a private individual operating through a limited liability company registered out of state. Elias had declined them all, not out of stubbornness, but caution. He wanted surveys, environmental assessments, time. Not everyone appreciated that pace. Investigators eventually identified the initial R as Rowan Keller, a regional land negotiator known for aggressive acquisition tactics that stayed just inside the bounds of legality. Keller had met Elias twice in person, once at the farmhouse and once at a diner in town. Witnesses described those meetings as tense but civil. Elias had reportedly told a friend that Keller talked like the deal was already done, a phrase he repeated more than once. Phone records showed multiple missed calls from Keller's number to Elias in the weeks before the disappearance. None were returned. When questioned, Keller acknowledged sending the last text, though not receiving it. He claimed that the message, "I'll handle it tomorrow," never appeared on his phone, suggesting it may have failed to deliver properly or been delayed in some technical way. He denied meeting Elias on the night of the disappearance and provided an alibi, placing him 2 counties away. The alibi held, at least on paper, but the connection lingered. The jacket pocket, investigators realized, could have held documents. A folded map, a note, something Elias intended to reference briefly. Something he didn't want to carry in his pants while eating dinner. Something related to the land near the ravine. Searchers returned to the area with new purpose. They examined the broken fence more closely and noticed that the boards had not just been struck, they had been pressed, as if something heavy had leaned against them before giving way. Tire marks near the tractor suggested a second vehicle may have been present earlier, though rain had erased most definitive patterns. No tracks could be matched to anything on record. Then there were the locals. A few residents quietly admitted that they had seen unfamiliar cars near the property in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Nothing consistent enough to build a timeline, but enough to fuel speculation. Elias, they said, had been more watchful lately, more guarded. He had begun locking the gate at night. That, in itself, was new. Still, nothing tied any individual directly to the moment Elias vanished. The land dispute provided motive, not proof. The investigation circled the same facts again and again, each pass bringing them no closer to resolution. And then something happened that no one could explain away as coincidence. Nearly 6 months after the disappearance, a hiker exploring a wooded area just beyond the ravine, technically off the Hendrix property, found a scrap of fabric caught in a thicket. It was dark, heavy, and familiar. Forensic testing confirmed it matched the lining of Elias's jacket. There was no blood on it. No DNA other than Elias's. But it had been torn, not cut. The location raised more questions than it answered. The area was outside the original search perimeter, in a place Elias had no reason to go alone. Yet the fabric suggested movement, forceful, directional, as if something had passed through there, carrying or dragging weight. The discovery reignited public interest, briefly lifting the case from its long dormancy. News vans returned. Theories resurfaced. Hope flickered, then dimmed again when follow-up searches revealed nothing else. What remained undeniable was this. Elias Hendrix did not simply fall. Whatever happened that night unfolded across landlines, through decisions made by more than one person, and in moments that left almost no trace behind. And somewhere in those moments, the truth slipped just far enough away to survive. Long after the official search ended and the news crews packed up their equipment, there were still people who could not let the disappearance of Elias Hendrix settle into the past. For them, the case did not feel unfinished. It felt interrupted, like a conversation that had been cut off mid-sentence and never resumed. One of them was Deputy Aaron Miles. He had grown up less than 10 miles from the Hendrix farm and remembered Elias as a constant presence, a man whose truck he recognized before he could read the name on the door. Officially, Miles was reassigned once the case stalled, but unofficially, he continued to carry it with him. He kept copies of reports in a folder at home, revisiting them late at night, tracing timelines with his finger, trying to find the moment where the story broke away from reason. What bothered him most was not the lack of evidence, but the pattern of restraint. Elias's life showed no signs of collapse, no financial panic, no emotional unraveling, no sudden isolation. Everything about him suggested continuity, not escape or self-destruction. Miles would later say that it felt less like a disappearance and more like an interruption, as if something external had stepped in and rewritten the ending. Volunteers felt it too. Several of them continued to walk the land long after the official search had been called off, often alone, often in silence. They said it wasn't hope that drove them anymore, but responsibility. Elias had shown up for the community his entire life, helping during storms, lending equipment, fixing fences without being asked. Walking his land felt like returning a favor that could never truly be repaid. Some reported strange experiences. A woman who had helped organize search efforts claimed she heard a radio playing near the farmhouse late one evening, long after the power had been shut off. A hunter swore he saw a light moving along the ravine just before dawn, steady and purposeful, like a flashlight carried by someone who knew exactly where they were going. None of these stories could be verified. All of them were dismissed. But they persisted, passed quietly from one person to another, adding to the unease rather than resolving it. Claire Hendrix did not return. After her brief visit, she settled the estate into a legal limbo that mirrored the investigation itself. The land remained unsold. The farmhouse remained locked. When asked years later why she hadn't pushed harder for closure, she reportedly said that doing so felt like choosing an ending, and she wasn't ready to choose the wrong one. Investigators changed. Sheriffs retired. New faces inherited old files. Each time the case was reopened, even briefly, it followed the same path. The timeline, the tractor, the text message, the ravine. And each time, it ended the same way, with no new conclusions and the quiet acknowledgement that whatever happened to Elias Hendrix had been executed with either extraordinary luck or extraordinary intention. The most enduring impact, however, was psychological. The disappearance reshaped how people saw the land itself. Familiar places became uncertain. Fields that once felt safe now carried the weight of unanswered questions. Parents warned their children not to wander too far. Farmers double-checked their gates at night. The idea that someone could vanish from ground they had mastered unsettled a community built on knowing its environment intimately. Because if Elias Hendrix could disappear there, anyone could. Years have passed since Elias Hendrix vanished, but time has not softened the edges of the Hendrix farm. If anything, it has sharpened them. Nature has continued its slow, indifferent work, reclaiming what was once ordered and familiar. Yet the land does not feel abandoned in the way forgotten places usually do. It feels paused, as if waiting for permission to move on. The farmhouse still stands, weathered but intact. Its paint has peeled, exposing older layers beneath, and the porch boards sag under their own age. The windows are dark, yet unbroken, and from the road, the house looks less like it has been left behind and more like it has been left alone. Locals swear that on certain evenings, just as the sun dips low enough to catch the glass at the right angle, the house appears occupied again, shadows forming where no one should be. The barns tell a quieter story. Inside, rust creeps along the machinery Elias once maintained with care. Tools hang exactly where he left them, their handles worn smooth by hands that will never return. Dust coats everything evenly, undisturbed by human presence, but not by memory. Anyone who steps inside says the same thing afterward, that it feels wrong to touch anything, like moving objects in a room that still belongs to someone. The ravine remains unchanged. Its edges are more overgrown now, its paths nearly invisible unless you know where to look. The fence has been repaired, but the boards are newer, cleaner, standing out against the weathered wood around them like a scar that never blended back in. The ground shows no sign of the chaos that once unfolded there, as if the land itself made a decision to erase the evidence. And yet, people still come. Not in groups, and not often, but enough to keep the story alive. True crime enthusiasts, urban explorers, the curious. They walk the perimeter, take photos from the road, and leave quickly, unsettled by a feeling they can't explain. Many report the same sensation, that the land feels watchful, not in a supernatural sense, but in a deeply human one, as if something unfinished still claims ownership. Officially, the case is cold. There have been no new discoveries, no confirmed sightings, no breakthroughs that change the narrative. The text message remains unresolved. The fragment of jacket lining remains the only physical trace beyond the farm itself. Rowan Keller moved on to other projects. The county archived the files. But unofficially, the story never ended. Every few years, a rumor surfaces. A man resembling Elias seen at a truck stop 2 states away. A quiet farmhand with familiar eyes working under a different name. A weathered figure spotted near the ravine at dawn. None are verified. All are compelling enough to circulate, then fade. The land has not been sold. Claire still owns it, though she has never returned. Developers have made offers. Each one declined without explanation. The Hendrix farm exists in a legal and emotional stasis, untouchable not by law, but by something closer to respect or fear. Because to change the land would mean admitting that whatever happened there is truly over. And for many, that feels impossible. As the years passed and the Hendrix case settled into the category of stories people told rather than investigations they actively pursued, the theories surrounding Elias's disappearance grew more refined. No longer reactive or emotional, they became careful constructions, attempts to force logic onto a story that resisted it at every turn. Each theory promised to explain everything. None truly did. The first was known among investigators as the controlled exit theory. According to this interpretation, Elias Hendrix had not vanished accidentally, nor had he been taken. He had left deliberately, using the farm and its dangers to manufacture a convincing disappearance. Supporters of this theory pointed to his meticulous nature. Elias planned everything. If anyone could orchestrate a clean exit, it would have been a man who understood land, machinery, and human assumptions as well as he did. The warm dinner, the boots left behind, the tractor disabled but not destroyed. These were not mistakes, they argued, but misdirection, elements meant to pull attention in the wrong direction. The text message fit neatly here as well. "I'll handle it tomorrow" sounded like closure, like a promise to resolve a problem quietly. Perhaps R was not a threat, but an accomplice. Perhaps tomorrow was the day Elias became someone else. But the theory faltered under one crucial question. Why leave behind the future he had just begun to rebuild? Those who knew about Claire found it impossible to believe Elias would disappear without telling her, especially after reopening that door so carefully. He was not a man who abandoned responsibilities. If this was an escape, it was one that required him to betray his own values, something no evidence ever suggested he was capable of doing. The second theory carried more weight, at least among locals. The confrontation theory. This version proposed that Elias had gone out that night expecting a brief, controlled interaction, perhaps a meeting related to the land dispute, perhaps a confrontation he believed he could manage. The jacket pocket suggested documents. The route home suggested intention. The tractor's position suggested interruption. Something went wrong, quickly and irreversibly. In this version of events, the tractor was not the cause, but the consequence. A distraction, a sudden movement, a moment of imbalance near unstable ground. Whether the other party panicked, fled, or attempted to hide what happened afterward remained unknown. The land, vast and uneven, did the rest. Yet this theory too collapsed under scrutiny. There was no trace of another person, no confirmed second vehicle, no evidence strong enough to move suspicion from possibility to probability, and no one had ever come forward, even anonymously, despite the years that had passed. The third theory was the oldest, and in many ways, the most uncomfortable. The land itself. This was not a supernatural explanation, but a practical one, rooted in the idea that nature does not always behave in ways humans can reconstruct. Sinkholes, underground erosion, unstable soil near the ravine, a collapse that swallowed a man whole and then settled back into place, leaving nothing visible behind. Geological surveys conducted years later found nothing definitive, but they did not rule it out either. The area was old, shifting, quietly dangerous. If Elias had stepped in the wrong place at the wrong moment, the land could have taken him in seconds. But this theory, too, left questions unanswered. It did not explain the text message. It did not explain the shut-off tractor. It did not explain the torn jacket fabric found beyond the ravine. Each theory solved one part of the puzzle while creating two more. And that was the pattern that haunted everyone who studied the case long enough. No explanation failed entirely, but none succeeded completely either. The truth, if it existed in a single, coherent form, remained just out of reach, fractured across timelines, motives, and terrain. Eventually, most people stopped trying to solve it. They accepted the uncertainty as part of the story, an uncomfortable but permanent companion. Elias Hendrix became less a missing man and more a question mark attached to a place, a reminder that some endings refuse to be pinned down. When large answers fail to appear, investigators, and those who refuse to let go, often turn to the smallest details. Not because they promise clarity, but because they are honest. They remain exactly as they were when everything else stopped. In the case of Elias Hendrix, those details were scattered throughout the farmhouse, preserved by neglect and time. In the kitchen, the radio still sat by the window. When the power was finally disconnected months after Elias disappeared, the radio went silent for good, but for a while it had continued to play every evening, its low murmur filling an empty house. The station it was tuned to never changed. Elias liked predictability. He liked knowing what voice would greet him without having to think about it. Some believed that habit mattered, that it meant he had not planned to be gone long enough for silence to feel permanent. On the refrigerator door, held in place by mismatched magnets, was a short list written in Elias's careful handwriting. Feed, fuel, fence repair. Below it, added later in a different pen, was a single word underlined once. Call Claire. The list was undated, but the ink was fresh. In the bedroom, investigators had cataloged every object, but few drew attention at the time. Only later did patterns begin to emerge. Elias's watch, found on the dresser, had not been taken off casually. It had been placed face up, aligned neatly with the edge of the wood. He removed it only when sleeping or bathing. If he had planned to be gone overnight, he would have worn it. The boots by the door told a similar story. They were clean, not freshly scrubbed, but not worn in the way they would have been after field work. That suggested Elias had not intended to work outside. At least, not in any meaningful way. Whatever drew him out that night was not a task. It was an interruption. In the barn, a notebook was discovered tucked into a drawer beneath the workbench. It was not a diary, but it might as well have been. Inside were measurements, sketches of fence lines, notes about soil density near the ravine. One page had been folded and unfolded so many times the crease had nearly torn through. Written in the margin were 3 letters. Our time? Edge. No date. No explanation. Some believed it referred to a meeting. Others thought it was simply a reminder to himself. The lack of context made it useless as evidence and powerful as implication. It suggested anticipation, not fear. Preparation, not flight. The jacket fragment found beyond the ravine was examined again years later using newer techniques. Fibers showed signs of stress consistent with being caught on branches while moving at speed, not dragged passively, but carried or worn by someone still upright. That detail alone reshaped how some people imagined the final moments. Less like a fall, more like movement. Still, none of these details could speak on their own. Together, they formed a portrait of a man who expected continuity. Elias Hendrix did not behave like someone saying goodbye. He behaved like someone managing loose ends, postponing resolution, assuming there would be time later. That assumption, tomorrow, echoed everywhere. Tomorrow, he would handle it. Tomorrow, he would call his daughter. Tomorrow, the land deal would move forward or fall apart. Tomorrow never arrived. And that, more than any theory, may be the most honest truth of the case. Elias Hendrix vanished not because he was ready to disappear, but because something interrupted a life still very much in progress. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for cases like this, one that never quite settles into mourning, because mourning requires certainty. The disappearance of Elias Hendrix did not give his family, his community, or even the investigators that certainty. Instead, it left them suspended in a space between hope and resignation, where every memory feels unfinished. For Claire, that space became permanent. Those close to her later said that she spoke of her father in the present tense for years without realizing it. Not as denial, but as habit. When there is no body, no funeral, no final moment to anchor loss, the mind resists closing the door. Elias became someone who was simply elsewhere. Someone who might still be reading the weather report, still walking the fence line, still planning tomorrow. That ambiguity shaped how she remembered him. She no longer replayed their last argument, or even their last conversation. Instead, she fixated on the almosts, the visit that was supposed to happen, the call written on the refrigerator list, the future that had finally begun to feel possible. In many ways, the reconciliation never failed. It was just postponed indefinitely. The community felt it too, though they rarely named it outright. People stopped telling the story as a mystery and started telling it as a warning. Parents used it to remind their children that land could not be trusted, that familiarity did not equal safety. Farmers spoke Elias's name when double-checking machinery, when choosing not to work after dark. His absence became a reference point, a silent instructor shaping behavior long after his voice was gone. Even investigators carried the weight of uncertainty differently. Some admitted that they preferred unsolved murders to disappearances like this. A crime, however tragic, follows a structure, cause, consequence, responsibility. Elias's case had none of that. It lingered. It invited speculation without offering confirmation. It forced those involved to accept that effort does not always produce resolution. And then there were the believers, not in the supernatural, but in survival. They believed Elias was alive because believing otherwise felt like surrender. They scanned crowds unconsciously, lingered on unfamiliar faces, felt a quiet jolt of recognition whenever they saw a man of similar build moving with the same deliberate pace. Each unconfirmed sighting was not proof, but it was permission to keep wondering. Uncertainty reshaped memory itself. Over time, people stopped agreeing on details they once shared. Elias's voice sounded different depending on who recalled it. His temperament softened in retelling. His flaws faded. The man became more symbolic than real, a vessel for whatever explanation the storyteller needed most: resilience, caution, injustice, hope. And that may be the strangest legacy of all. When a story has no ending, it does not stay still. It evolves. It absorbs fear, belief, and time. Elias Hendrix became less a person who disappeared and more a question that lived on, quietly, persistently, in the minds of those who remembered him. Because certainty allows grief to end. Uncertainty makes it eternal. What follows is not a conclusion, but a reconstruction, the most coherent version of that night assembled from facts, habits, terrain, and human behavior. It is not offered as truth, only as a path through the darkness that does not require the story to break itself to make sense. On that evening, Elias Hendrix came home as he always did. Nothing about his posture, his pace, or his actions suggested fear. He ate dinner. He listened to the radio. He planned for tomorrow. Whatever tension existed in his life was familiar, manageable, something he believed he could control. Then something interrupted him. It was not an emergency. Not at first. The absence of panic inside the house suggests that Elias did not feel threatened. More likely, it was a message, literal or implied, that asked for his attention briefly. A request to talk. To look at something. To clear something up. Something that could wait until after dinner. Elias put on his jacket, the one with the inside pocket, because he intended to step out, not go to work. He left his boots because he did not expect to be gone long. He left his phone charging because this was not a situation that required distance or documentation. It was, in his mind, contained. He may have driven the tractor intentionally, not to work the land, but to meet near it. The tractor provided light, mobility, and a sense of normalcy. If anyone were watching from a distance, it would look like routine farm business. Nothing worth noticing. Near the ravine, something changed. Perhaps another vehicle waited where Elias could not see it from the house. Perhaps words were exchanged, controlled, tense, but not explosive. The jacket pocket contents, whatever they were, may have come out. A map, a document, a boundary line drawn too close for comfort. The tractor did not fail on its own. It was shut off. In that moment, when Elias stepped down, when attention shifted away from the machine, momentum took over. Whether from a misstep, a shove, or a sudden movement meant to create distance, the tractor rolled. It broke the fence. It made the sound that echoed across the fields and froze someone miles away in place without them knowing why. The chaos was brief. The footprints suggest Elias moved away from the tractor under his own power at first. He was not unconscious. Not immediately. He walked toward the ravine's edge, either following someone or being directed there, the ground uneven beneath him. Then something happened that changed the rhythm of his steps, something sudden enough to erase the trail. What happened next may have taken seconds. Whether Elias fell, was pulled, or was forced into a place the land does not easily give back, the result was the same. The ravine, unstable and deep, swallowed the final answers. The jacket tore as branches caught hold. Fabric stayed behind. The rest did not. The text message came later, not as a confession, but as containment. A delay. I'll handle it tomorrow. Reads less like Elias and more like someone speaking on his behalf, someone buying time, assuming there would be a next day to clean up uncertainty. There wasn't. By morning, the land had already begun its quiet work of erasure. By the time people arrived, the story had fragmented beyond repair. This version explains the shut-off engine, the lack of panic in the house, the footprints that stop without conclusion, the jacket fragment beyond the ravine, the message that should not exist. It does not explain who else was there, and it does not have to, because sometimes the most honest reconstruction is not the one that answers every question, but the one that allows them to exist without contradiction. In the end, the Hendrix farm did not become evidence. It became a reminder. Years after Elias Hendrix vanished, nothing new surfaced. No confession, no discovery, no moment where all the scattered pieces finally locked into place. The case did not explode into revelation or collapse into certainty. It simply stayed, suspended in time, like the land itself. The fields continue to grow wild. The farmhouse continues to stand. The ravine continues to cut through the property, unchanged and uninterested in human understanding. The silence that surrounds it is no longer shocking. It is familiar, worn smooth by repetition. And yet, the story refuses to die. Because Elias Hendrix was not a man who disappeared while running from something. He was a man who disappeared while moving forward, toward reconciliation, toward resolution, toward a future that had finally begun to take shape. That is what unsettles people most. Not the mystery of how he vanished, but the injustice of when. He was supposed to call his daughter. He was supposed to make a decision about the land. He was supposed to wake up the next morning and continue living the careful, deliberate life he had built. Instead, the farm kept the last word. Every theory explains something. None explain everything. And perhaps that is the point. Some places absorb stories rather than release them. Some disappearances do not want to be solved. They want to be remembered. If Elias Hendrix is gone, then the land holds him. If he survived, then the land protected his escape. Either way, the farm remains the keeper of the truth. And until that truth surfaces, if it ever does, the Hendrix farm will stand as it does now, quiet, abandoned, and watching, not as a crime scene, not as a legend, but as a question.